mad interesting to me. I was about to go to sleep and this just woke me up. 1988. I don't know if I want to read all of that. They're telling you all this. The guy's name is John Orr Stockwell. It says born 1937, is a former CIA officer who became a critic of United States government policies after serving 7 tours of duty over 13 years. Having managed American involvement in the Angolan Civil War as chief of the Angola Task Force during its 1975 covert operations, he resigned and wrote In Search of Enemies. Okay, so that's the guy who was talking, and they went into his whole ass background. I'm not going to read that. First comment under the thing, it says, the live chat for this will be filled with people championing lesser evilism and defending their party from every criticism, no matter how true and accurate. Most of the Americans who agree with me still vote, work a job, and pay taxes. The unified system these political elites co-curate is all we feel we have, which means we need to build new bases of power and new systems and not fight for control over crumbling international oligarchic tyrannies. Wow, that was a mouthful. I'm so glad I'm reading these comments. Another one. Damn it, this light is too bright. Let's kill this one. It says a puppet master needs at least 2 puppets. At minimum, a triangulation is required, ancient psychology. But you could have 1 too many, more than 2. Make them think they figured it out on their own through debates, drama, and circumstances. Influence should remain secret and invisible, and if brought up, make it seem like a conspiracy theory. Ridicule it among educated people. The art of puppetry. Excellent. Another comment, it says, I've seen many of John Stockwell's videos. What a wonderful storyteller. Great to watch. Another comment, I wish I'd seen this back when it was new. I highly doubt that this kind of program will be able to be aired now. Unfortunately, we don't live in a free country. I hope that many more people see this very important video. Thank you. I think it's very important too, and I also think you wouldn't be able to nowhere close to it, because what was it, 84, and this came out in 86. No way you'd be able to do anything on one of the presidents of now or CIA or anything like that right now. No way. Look at Julian Assange. I'll never hear anyone talk about him and the system like this anymore. His dad tried to overthrow Franklin D. Roosevelt, and the corruption that has been running rampant in this country is rarely talked about. These guys nailed it, and this rings more true today than ever. I wish he could see how bonkers and crazy it really has become in 30 years. Another comment. This is so true. I've been calling Republicans the monoparty for a long time. Another one, it says, excellent interview. Many thanks for all the brilliant videos on this channel. Another comment. Whatever became of Stanley Meyer's water-powered car? That would fix the elite's tidal red wagon permanently. Some more. This should be compulsory in every high school modern history class. Another one, it says, great job. Keep the truth alive for humanity and the planet and to wake up the masses. This, and let me get your comments on this, Dot.
We'll be discussing that with John today. John is a peace activist, a writer, a lecturer, an ex-CIA agent, and now a prominent critic of the CIA, who currently is working on 2 books, one on the Vietnam War and another on the arms race. He's also been commissioned by Oliver Stone to write a screenplay about Central America and has been very busy lecturing, traveling around the country, and doing research since we last saw him on Alternative Views. So welcome back, John.
My pleasure.
And it looks like our crew didn't show up, so I'm going to have to do a camera operator for all three cameras, as well as participate in this.
Okay, well, jump in whenever you feel like it.
Man of
Frank.
many talents.
Right.
This is like the old days.
So, John, I think everyone is concerned about what the election of George Bush will mean for American foreign and domestic policy and what a Bush presidency would be like. We're currently in the period, the honeymoon period, where all the media are just celebrating him, being nice to him. All the politicians are snookering up to him. So let's give a critical perspective on the Bush presidency that we really haven't heard from our corrupt mainstream media.
It's a tough one. This is, of course, the calm before the storm, perhaps. We have so little to go on. The man's been a vice president, politician. The responsible people say, give him a break, let's wait and see what he does. My own position, and then they say, well, he is such a chameleon, but he could go either way, so to speak. And they point out that he was historically more moderate than Reagan, who has always had a wild hair up his nose. But I personally am more of the school that I believe we do know a lot about this man. In fact, we know some things about him that are much more significant and frightening than what we knew about Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was, of course, a committed conservative who was known to have a slightly defective mind. Who
and
had
proved that was the case.
And proved it and lived up to, and had some harsh policies when he was governor of California. But Bush, this CIA directorship where he made these contacts, I worked for him. You know, I witnessed personally his supervising the CIA's covering up of illegal activity at the end of the Angola operation in early 1976. And he was actually fending off the hostile Congress. Instead of investigating and firing perpetrators of crimes, he was fending off the FBI and the Congress on at least 3 or 4 major CIA criminal activities.
What were those activities?
Well, one was the Angolan operation, where we had broken a number of laws, much like the Iran-Contra and the Bolan kind of laws. And then we had conspired to cover up the breaking of the laws. And I mean, literally, we sat around the big oak tables and discussed the law. We went down to the library and read up on the law. And then things like, I remember one session reminding the boss, you know, don't contradict yourself. Or last week you said, you know, don't contradict yourself. This week, if Senator so-and-so brings up a certain issue. And this one, he just plowed right into that one. And he was just telling the Senate, you know, the Congress, I don't know, I wasn't here, but I'm sure that I just find it very difficult to believe, but we'll look into it thoroughly. If you'll just give me some slack. And he was reassuring them. And with you know, him patting him on the head, they backed off and just never got back to it. He was also doing the same thing about the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, which was being investigated in that cycle. And also the Chilean operation, the killing of, you know, the Track 1, Track 2 ouster and killing of Salvador Allende in Chile. And he was fending off an investigation of that. In the FBI stuff, the Justice Department was investigating some of the mercenaries who had been involved in the CIA's Angola program. And they were asking us specifically which ones had worked for us and in what capacities. And a young attorney showed up from the General Counsel's office responding to Bush's supervision policies. And
oh, that's a cute kitty. Yeah, man, I love cats. I got a thing for cats.
That's Rorschach. He's my boy.
Yeah. Big old cat. Yeah, I got a thing for them.
actually went to my files and purged documents that he thought would be legally incriminating if we were subpoenaed, if we were investigated. And all of that was a thorough indication of Bush's policies as I witnessed them. Beyond that, we have an incredible record that we'll get into in greater depth as we chat here now of the connections that he picked up when he was CIA director. So we have not only Noriega, but we have dozens of Noriegas who have blackmail control of this man. Now, one would like to give anyone the benefit of the doubt and say, hopefully they're going to be more moderate, but this man even wished he to be more moderate on CIA activities, would have an uphill fight because that establishment has got so much dirt on him. And I personally don't believe he really has any desire or instincts to withdraw from them. I think he sees a secret world that goes back to that skull and bones thing at Yale, that kind of secret elite manipulation, the Knights of Malta. I think psychologically he's just deeply committed to a view of the world where there's elite insiders who are well above the normal laws of man and God.
You look at see who's been the heads of the CIA all these years, and it's been people who've been right up at the top and interlocked with the top people in the American power structure. It seems that that's such an important part, running an intelligence service, that the establishment people don't want any outsiders doing it.
Well, what is the implication then of having an ex-CIA director, the President of the United States? This is the first time that this has ever happened, that someone who is so deeply involved in intelligence activities is actually the president.
Well, it's a giant step towards the national security state is what it is. It's a huge victory for the national security establishment. And always remember that although it goes far beyond the CIA, but the CIA was created in the National Security Act of 1947. And the national security establishment has the CIA as one of the inner chapters, so to speak. And to have one of its directors bought into the thing totally and controlled by all of the illegal activities that he's been privy to and part of, it means just that. We've been watching and worrying, and people have been writing books for 15 years about the national security state. And this.
Wait, I don't want to bore everybody to death, Doc. So give the audience some little background on a little bit of what he's talking about. Noriega, Bush Sr., the planes.
Basically, the problem with this is the fact that a CIA director became the president. He knows our secrets. He knows not just the regular things that congressmen know, but he knows the deep, dark, secret shit that we friggin' did. And that is kind of a problem in a way because, you know, it creates a political state where a police state is now, someone who was from a police state is now in charge. The game is different. The mentality is different. And
exactly. So what are the implications of that related to Noriega, the planes, the drugs?
Well, again, that's something I need to look more into because that was all going on before I really started, you know, realizing I need to pay more attention to what's going on with my government.
Yeah, I was a little kid.
That was actually the kind of stuff that was where I was at, was like, hey, I need to start figuring out what the hell. And that was that in that era right there where I was like, you know, so I don't know a lot about it. Again, one of those things that I need to research. I can come up with shit in a couple of minutes, but not comprehensively enough to make a statement one side or the other.
Yeah, so, well, just for the audience, like Bush, he was in trouble. They were looking at him, and
remember, we didn't have internet back then. We couldn't look this shit up from every side of point of view in the world.
Yeah, And I want to say, was it Reagan? I know Bush. They was looking at him, and it was like, "Oh, this guy is behind this stuff." And so, but still, he became president, and and he had all these major connections with these, shady individuals, basically. I'm gonna play some more.
Is a giant step in that direction, is what it amounts to.
So does that mean that the CIA will have much more influence in current policy than they would have otherwise? And that Bush has this mentality, the sort of conspiratorial, covert action, interventionist view of the world that these people have. How do you think that might translate practically into an increased role for the CIA? Or increased influence on Bush?
You get into some nuances or personalities, if you will. Overall, the establishment that the CIA represents is much stronger, having Bush as president. However, it's difficult to imagine the CIA being more dominant and active than it was under William Casey, for the simple reason that the man was wild, Wild Bill Casey,
Right.
And he was running poorly thought out, very aggressive operations in every corner of the world. Now, Bush has decided to go with William Webster. Now, Webster is no saint.
As the head of the CIA.
As the head of the CIA, which means,
right?
Yes, which means the head of the intelligence community, because the CIA director coordinates all of the intelligence in the 7 bureaucracies. Webster is no saint. It's not that, that it makes you feel reassured. In fact, he ran COINTELPRO 2 in the FBI under Reagan when they were harassing the people who were supporting or lobbying against the Contras. And but what's the most ominous thing about this man is that the establishment exonerated him totally. He was permitted by the Congress, by the establishment, by the Washington Post media, at the end of that thing, when it was exposed, of taking the idiots out, the stupidity out, the moron out, of saying, well, it's true I was director of the FBI, but I wasn't aware of any of these activities. And, the Admiral's ship sinks, and he said, well, I wasn't aware it had a hole in the side.
It sounds like the Ronald Reagan deficient management style, or simply lying.
And Bush used the same out. He sat in 17 meetings of the National Security Council in which they discussed the Iran-Contra scandal, and he says he doesn't remember there ever having talked about it.
There was also another interesting thing that he said when they asked him about Oliver North on one of the TV things. He said, well, they made 2 or 3 mistakes. The fact that it was all illegal never even fazed him. It didn't make any difference.
Back to Webster, though, it's interesting to note that 2 levels of the intelligence or national security establishment, not the community, the hard, the paid professionals, the on-duty professionals, but the community has spoken out at 2 levels. One, at the Henry Kissinger level, they've gotten together and published a paper in which they have spelled out policies that Bush should follow, which speak pretty openly of brutality towards the Third World. And then at a level below that, the Georgetown professors, where McFarlane went to work after he left the White House, where Ray Klein and others operate from, where they publish these books, the intelligence requirements for the 80s, and now they've come out for the 90s. These people, Robert Gates, the former deputy director, these people have come out with publications and statements and radio interviews and whatnot, vigorously protesting Webster as CIA director because they say he is soft on covert action. He's not aggressive enough.
Yet we know that Bush is such a believer in covert action that at least it's unlikely there'll be that much of a curtailing of covert action.
Well, we're getting into nuances. They're going to run operations for sure. It's a question of how many and how wild. And then at a certain point, you see, it's almost in the world's interest. God knows this is a perverse kind of logic, but it's almost in the world's interest to have a William Casey as opposed to William Webster. because Casey would go so far that he would self-destruct.
Right.
He was truly crazy, wild. And so these things would be exposed,
Right.
and there would be a reaction. The Congress would clash with him
Right.
endlessly. He would mining the harbors and lie about it. Whereas Webster is muting it with the Congress and building good relations. And by having a little bit better judgment, he may actually accomplish more in the long run, and it may be harder for us to crack it open.
John, could you go into some more detail on this blackmail theme of how Bush might be subject to blackmail because of his involvement in the CIA and in other activities during the Reagan administration? What would be an example of this, and how would such blackmail work?
Well, let's go into the most obvious case that we know of, the one that we have the best documented so far. And this is this Black Eagle thing that was started in 82. Essentially, in a reversal of roles, the CIA is actually created to give the White House and the executive plausible deniability, so they can keep clean, and if the CIA does something wrong, they can, well, we didn't know about it, and they can fire the CIA's director. William Casey reversed this policy, and it was actually quite clever in retrospect in the Iran-Contra thing. He initiated the Iran-Contra thing, but he managed to have Ronald Reagan and the White House take the heat for it. He ran it through Oliver North. So it became a political thing, whereas the CIA was clearly under the thumb of the Congress, or should have been, or legally was. But he also, this Black Eagle operation of delivering arms to the Contras, he got George Bush to front for that, to use the vice president's office to front for that. And Bush was a very activist vice president, running this thing they had on anti-terrorism, supposedly, which is, of course, 1984 doublespeak for, running terrorist activities, smuggling arms. And through that operation, they began to work through Panama and the planes flying through Panama, and Noriega gave them access to the airstrips that they needed, and immediately began working the other end of the line through the Medellin, using the same Black Eagle planes to fly drugs up here into the United States. And Bush his office was running this thing. Now, obviously, they tried to maintain what I thought was a very thin, implausible deniability of having Don Gregg running the thing right out of George Bush's office with his assistant, what's his name, Samuel Watts.
So they're talking about the drugs and guns. So, and then the Mexican cartel, and basically Bush's office supervising all of this shit. And they have proof of this stuff. And it's really common knowledge, but it's super interesting, though, I think, to go back and revisit this stuff, because I only had briefly heard about some of this stuff. I never really dug into it, and I really want to dig a little bit more into this stuff. So, because this was my childhood, and this explains what happened.
I know it's a fictional. I know it's a fictional presentation, but you really need to catch Narcos on Netflix.
Yeah, and
good show, touches around the subject, not accurate, but enough details that you can research based off of it and find out the real truth.
El Salvador, and then a network that went throughout, planes flying throughout, Southern Air Transport involved, their own airplanes involved, and yet the only deniability was Gregg saying, well, I never told the vice president about all of these things, which is utterly impossible. It is not within the realm of human, unless the person were a Ronald Reagan, And even then, he would have had to have known what Gregg was doing.
Can you give us a little background on Gregg, the fact that he and Bush had been together in the CIA and buddies for a long time?
Yeah, Gregg was not an original. I think he came into the CIA in '51, a graduate of Williams College. At the height, that was getting into the McCarthy era, the height of conservatism, the Korean War, a very, very conservative era. And he joined and had what was ultimately a tremendously successful career. In fact, I thought that Bush would wind up appointing him as a CIA director, and instead he's gone with William Webster. The guy had to do with the destabilization of Cuba in the 60s. He wound up in Vietnam in Military Region 3 in 1970, and that's where I was, except I didn't overlap with him. But I got there just after he had left, so there were a lot of people were talking about him and about Felix Rodriguez,
who was one of his favorite operatives in Vietnam.
In the height of the Phoenix program.
And Shackley was his boss, wasn't he?
And Shackley was the boss.
So you see the same group moving in with George Bush then in the basement of the White House, right next door to Oliver North.
Minus Shackley.
Shackley wasn't.
Yeah, minus Shackley, who had been squeezed out by then.
But Shackley was still in operation, involved in a lot of these things.
Well, I'm sure the old boy thing worked so that he was in contact with them, but don't ever forget that these people fight a lot. They are as bad as people in the peace movement about Guam, literally. You remember when Black Eagle eventually fell apart, and then the Enterprise kind of came apart. Oliver North and Felix Rodriguez were at each other's throats. Mm-hmm. And these are two very volatile, unstable, dangerous men who couldn't get along. You remember the incident that's cited in the Foreign Policy Fall 88 issue that broke Black Eagle was when the CIA operatives, it doesn't name them, and the Israeli operatives drew their pistols on each other.
This was 1985.
85.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. And they were about to start blasting each other away, and the senior head said, everybody cool it, just, slow down, and prevailed and got everybody to put their guns back. And at the same time, the Pollard case was breaking, and the U.S. was going to prosecute the Pollards, and Israel didn't appreciate that. So it
who had been spying for Israel and
against the United States.
Right. And yeah.
Can you clarify something for me, or are you through with it? What you?
No, there's so much of this material. Yeah,
I'm a bit confused now. Oliver North's office was next door to George Bush and Donald Gregg's in the bottom of the White House, as I understand it. Now, were they working together, or as I've heard some people say, they actually had two separate arms running and drug smuggling operations going, or were they separate but coordinated?
Well, they have done everything they could to obfuscate, if you will, and confuse the issue. North admitted that he met with Bush on many occasions, but he minimized the cooperation. The way I see it is there were a number of different offices, and people did have different roles to play, and there were different power lines working. And don't ever forget that there is just a norm of every presidency since I've been around anyway, is a lot of intense competitiveness. I mean, they're really ruthless. Everybody's jockeying for position endlessly inside the White House and the vice president's office, if he has any power. So North was definitely part of the same machinery. He was definitely cooperating with George Bush as Bush was cooperating with Casey. But at the same time, North was definitely beating his own drum and tooting his own horn and flying around the world grandstanding and setting his... They were not it was not a disciplined unit like one CIA office would be, or one Marine division would be, or one of your Navy ships would be. And these are a lot of competing people who are in the same ideology, the same administration, and moving in the same direction, with the same evil intention.
The way that the Rolling Stone told this story in their November 3rd essay on the dirty secrets of George Bush, the Black Eagle operation that Bush, Rodriguez, and Gregg were running was coming apart because of this rupture with the Israelis, and also because they found out Noriega was running so many drugs that this was threatening the integrity of the operation. So North began this other enterprise, literally called the Enterprise, with Richard Secord and Hakeem and these people to bring arms down to the Contras. But Secord had trouble getting it off, so that Felix Rodriguez began another operation. And once Secord got his going, they shut down the operation with Rodriguez's Cuban friends who had lost a lot of money in this and were very angry. And this began the tension between Rodriguez and Bush and the Secord North group. And eventually the tensions there sort of exploded. And Bush was the guy supposedly trying to hold everything together. That when these other guys, North and Rodriguez, were at each other's throats, Bush was the guy that had to smooth things over. So again, he played a major role in carrying out these operations, according at least to these this Rolling Stone story that seemed fairly well documented.
No, I endorse it. The way you describe it is the way I have read it myself very much. That in fact, the original outfit, they had built this giant warehouse called the Arms Supermarket and stocked it with arms which was supposed to be bought by the Contras with U.S. taxpayers' dollars or the private enterprise dollars. And at the time that North pulled away from that enterprise to start the enterprise, they had that thing stocked with $18 million worth of arms. Now, you know, arms is a cash-for business, and this cash had to come from the Medellin Colombian cocaine cartel.
Right.
So there was drug money that they had been working with that had stocked this warehouse, counting on selling the arms to the enterprise small e, and then North did break away at the point where he saw that thing apparently as getting out of control, as being too explosive. Now, it was not. Don't anyone misunderstand that he was morally troubled by working with people who were smuggling drugs. He had known for years these people were smuggling drugs. But as you noted, the volume of it was getting so high that he saw an earthquake coming and actually moved. There also was undoubtedly part of his ego, power play, power struggle at the level of him and Rodriguez, at the level perhaps of him and Gregg.
During this whole time, George Bush was supervisor. He was control of the anti-drug program in the United States, not just the propaganda bit, you know, just say no, but a great and very expensive operation to interdict drugs and to keep them from coming into the United States. So it was a perfect circle, not only from the propaganda point of view, because Bush could be said to be the guy who was keeping it from coming in, but on the covert aspect, he could make sure that this stuff came in undetected.
And yet, none of these stories came out during the election campaign. When I left for Europe on August the 17th, during the Republican convention, Dukakis was 10 or 15 points ahead. Bush had just nominated chosen Quayle, as vice president. That looked like it was going to be a self-destruct operation. And when I came back a month later, Bush was 10 points ahead. What do you make of this? How do you analyze Bush's turning things around and winning the presidency? What was involved in this?
Well, one just quick observation is there's some false polling in the summer. After the Democratic convention, the Democrats always look better. They've gotten a lot of publicity. And then a month later, after the Republican convention, they have a surge back. And so it's sometime about the 1st of September where the polls, I think, I forget the figure, but it's something like 9 times out of 10, the one who is leading on the 1st of September wins. So it's stabilized by the end of August. And in fact, by the end of August, Bush was ahead again. The Quayle thing was a heavy hit of Bush. One might call it a major blunder, but since he succeeded, we all reflected on that a lot. His choice of Quayle, as I see it, was twofold. He had to pick someone who would make him look like a giant. And that was not easy to do. if he picked Bob Dole,
Right.
for example,
Right.
someone who knew more and had a stronger personality,
Right.
he would have all kinds of problems. He also, in my opinion, and this is an analyst's opinion, you know, this is not based on any hard quotes or anything, very subjective, but he also had to pick someone who was bought into the Iran-Contra scandal. And Quayle was. He was the senator from Indiana, and Indiana's the state that John Hull, you know, came from, who was the man who had the ranch in Costa Rica, from which all the drug smuggling and the arms, you know, from the southern side of the Contra thing had been run. And it turns out, as we dug up in August and found out, this young man working for Quayle introduced Hull to Oliver North originally, and that young man's name was Robert Owens.
And
And
Owens
so
was involved in all this?
Owens was working for
God.
Quayle when he
That I hadn't
introduced
seen.
John Hull. Oh yes, when he introduced John Hull to Oliver North and gave them that whole option, which evolved into the enterprise and the whole scandal.
That's incredible. The whole interconnections, all of this,
Yeah.
even Quayle. I mean, this
So
is
you see,
amazing.
To go back, this is a very complicated thing, but I think we can sort it out. I don't think Bush dared to have someone in office who was clean of the Iran-Contra thing, like Dole, who could benefit from an impeachment.
So he needed someone that would be tainted enough with the Iran-Contra that they would be forced to resign at the same time.
They would be impeached with him, who could not possibly benefit from his impeachment. He needed to create a situation
to protect himself,
where the establishment couldn't shunt him aside and put in a strong figure like Dole or Howard Baker, who would be very acceptable to the public and to the establishment.
Right.
And that's where Quayle came. And that Barbara Honegger, who is not the world's greatest analyst, but she certainly has a lot of fire and imagination, and she coined the phrase that Quayle was Bush's impeachment insurance.
Right.
Who was she? Can you tell us who
Barbara Honegger worked for the Bush-Reagan campaign in 1980, and then quit in a volatile protest of their activities, and has made a crusade out of exposing the October surprise.
We might as well get into this, since this is one of the stories that was covered over by the mainstream media. What was her initial story?
Well, her initial story was that the Reagan-Bush campaign, William Casey, the Reagan-Bush campaign had made a deal with the Iranians to keep the embassy hostage through the elections, and then another 76 days, so that Carter wouldn't even get credit for their release, you know, so that Reagan would get the full credit for their release.
Right.
And they were, in fact, released 2 hours after he was sworn in, which was enough time for the word to get back to Iran that he was, in fact, president. And then, the hostages were released. They were actually held at the airport waiting for this confirmation. And then to go back to our other thing we were working on here is, why didn't Dukakis take Bush's head off with this stuff? Which he could have. God knows, you can see the television commercials or shows, you know, or interview 5-minute segments showing the Noriega link, the Black Eagle, the whole stuff. We had all of this. And we were definitely trying to feed it to them. And what we got back from them was
this is from the Dukakis
campaign. The Dukakis, and we got inside. We got the movie Cover Up delivered to them. We got the movie, the PBS Frontline show Guns, Drugs, and the CIA delivered to them. We got in to see them. Some of the people in this broad, disorganized group of scholars researching this thing. And we got from them a resistance. They essentially, and feedback, as one of the senior Dukakis people told Jim Driscoll, who's in our community with the America's Peace Test in Nevada, that John Stockwell's facts are all screwed up. And I immediately, what facts? What is it? Because I consider myself, if not an academic, nevertheless a scholar of these things. And so, what facts? Because I want to check them out. Because if I am screwed up, I don't. And they wouldn't give us any details, but they just rejected the stuff out of hand. Now, if you permit me, just very quickly to create a scenario or give you my analysis
Please.
of what happened. And we note the scandal broke or was broken by the establishment in November of '86, the Iran-Contra scandal, and it led to a dismantling of the Reagan White House. And then later they gave him his credibility back with the INF agreement. Now, in the winter of 1987, George Bush was written up by every major columnist as being out of business. He was finished politically. They were saying this openly. George Will was writing columns that the Republican Party was out. The Democrats were clearly going to win the next time around, and they were all writing that George Bush could not survive the Iran-Contra scandal. And this is because they, including the conservative columnists and the establishment press, had this material back then.
Right.
And they knew about George Bush's involvement in all of this stuff.
Right.
And the scandal was breaking, and they did not believe that he could survive.
Right.
By the spring, he had survived to the point, battling, as I put it, to stay out of jail. He
Right.
had hung in there. He didn't resign or retire. And they began to wonder what the U.S. People's tolerance was of this scandal, how much it would stick. Then they engineered the Iran-Contra hearings in the summer, which were carefully orchestrated by Danny Inouye, the Democrat,
Right.
In cooperation with the other Democrats. Cohen and Mitchell, for example, wrote the book Men of Zeal,
Right.
which they profess to be an expose of behind the scenes, but they do not, in fact, expose. It's a continuation of the cover-up. They do not, for example, discuss their resistance at having of allowing the Black Eagle stuff to be investigated, and their own resistance of having the George Bush drug linkage investigated. So the committee drew a line and said, we won't investigate beyond this line. So they gave the nation the appearance of an airing, and they did not, in fact, probe into the things that would have led them into the impeachment of George Bush. And this had a catharsis effect on the nation. And then we get into the fall, and then the winter of '88, and then the spring, and there's still a debate going on in public. Remember Dan Rather, who tried to nail Bush.
Right.
He tried to break this stuff
On
into
that
the
special
open.
CBS interview.
And what happened was the establishment came down on him and said, no, we're not going to go after George Bush. Until eventually, in the summer of '88, when we were once again trying to break this, Bush eventually was able to laugh at the cameras at the Republican convention, because we had journalists, we had found journalists who would ask the questions, who went up on national television and said, what about the Iran-Contra thing? And he just laughed at them and said, I'm not even going to answer those questions anymore. The nation doesn't care about the Iran-Contra scandal. That is history. I've answered those questions. Forget it. Don't ask me anymore. Now, in the meantime, this establishment, this party that we have, the single-party state, this fraternity that runs this country, that has two chapters, a Republican and a Democrat, one a little bit more liberal than the other one more conservative, representing the big business interests more directly. That's the Republicans. In terms of their interests, that's the A team. But they always have the B team that they can run out. A Jimmy Carter, when Richard Nixon makes the nation too angry, or the nation gets too riled at the Vietnam War, or something like that. This is where they produced Michael Dukakis. He's a team player to the establishment. In order to be accepted as a presidential candidate, he did homage to the arms race. He said eventually that he would give humanitarian aid to the Contras. He would consider it. He said definitely he would give military aid to El Salvador, which means he bought into all the principles of the covert secret government, of the covert operations, of the covert manipulation of the world.
He was singing another song when he was trying to get the Democratic nomination.
That's right. Before, his background was progressive, but he bought in. They screened him into the system. They groomed him into the system. He was advised that he could run, but if he would. So what he was there is if the nation had clung, had its outrage had been sufficient over the Iran-Contra scandal, they had Dukakis standing by, the B team to their interests, and he would give them some grief by spending some money on housing and on medical insurance for people and things like that. which is not their choice of the way to invest the money. They want to invest it in missiles and things where they make greater profits. But he would support the arms race, and he would support the CIA and the covert establishment, the national security state's activities. But then they realized they did not have to go with the B team. The people didn't care. They didn't have to give the nation a B team. So they went ahead and went with the A team, which was George Bush, i.e. they concluded eventually that they could Teflonize Bush despite all of this incredible activity and sell him to the nation, and they did.
One fucking two wings of the same bird. Please, did y'all hear that? Let me see something.
Why, though, did Dukakis as the B team not go after Bush more aggressively?
Because he's a member of the team. He's a member of the fraternity. Why did Dan Inouye? They had Ronald Reagan and George Bush by the short hairs. They could have impeached them, and they didn't, because they couldn't impeach a popular president like Reagan and Bush without losing control, the public trust. See, this gets back into the Howard Zinn thesis that the American Revolution occurred when the rich white males over here wanted to take power away from the same element in England, and they engineered a deal with the people whereby they would give more freedom to the people than they had under the monarchy or the colony. But nevertheless, the rich white males would retain control. And this dynamic relationship, we don't have a democracy. We do not, even to this day, vote for the president. We vote for electors who select the president. In addition to which, this two-party system we've evolved gives them further control, because even the selection of the candidates, it's done by about 50% vote, popular vote through the primaries, and about 50% through the frozen delegates, or the hard delegates, or the super delegates, who are party hacks, who control, the party machinery, controlling ultimately who gets nominated. This is why Pat Schroeder gave it a run and dropped out, is because her traveling and consulting with the super delegates, the frozen delegates, the power structure of the party, she was told she would not be permitted to win whatever happened, on the popular side of things. And then once that was decided, the money was not available to her. Now, this system, as it has continued for 200 years, is a tenuous relationship in which the people who own the country, the people on the the Federal Reserve Board, the people who manage the money and the moneyed interest, the strength of the capitalist system, these people know that they're riding a potentially rebellious horse in the American people, whose interests are not being fully served. Myth has to be maintained to make this thing run. And it's a constant balance of what do they have to give the people to keep them on board the system, and at what point are they going to lose the system. You read the history through Zinn's eyes of the United States, or the Graham book on the history of violence in the United States, and you see that every time the people have become angry enough, the system has yielded to them. The labor struggles at the turn of the century, for example, the Vietnam War and Civil Rights days, when blacks rose up in the country with a massive boycott, and it began to really hurt the economic interests.
And start burning down the small businesses in the ghettos, and white businesses,
and Detroit and Watts and 14th Street in Washington. And when the system was breaking apart, the establishment yielded every time. And the system self-destructed. The cynicism of the Reagan years, in which one of the more dramatic transfers of wealth from the poor to the rich occurred, was orchestrated by Ronald Reagan through the arms race, the $2 trillion on arms, the mechanisms that he set up for him, the rigging of the taxes, where he could say taxes had been cut when they had been redistributed to hurt the middle class and poor more. This thing came to a head under the Iran-Contra scandal. And once again, the establishment was faced in the winter of '87. They were saying, we've had it, the people have had it, and we're going to have to give them the Democrats for a while. And they came up eventually with what was to them brilliant. The perfect candidate was Dukakis, who had a reputation of being clean after the corruption of the Reagan years, who had a reputation of being somewhat of a populist, as Jimmy Carter did, who could be sold as a cleansing, sort of as a, here, we sympathize, here, you can have your president for a while. The truth is that Jimmy Carter had foisted upon him Zbig Brzezinski, who was an utter fascist in his policies to control the national security decisions. So Carter's human rights stuff couldn't go too far, and he wound up setting in motion the arms buildup that eventually evolved into the Reagan arms buildup, which is the biggest peacetime buildup in the history of, the biggest arms buildup in the history of the world.
And Brzezinski moved into the Bush camp during this campaign.
Oh, indeed. And
no, there's no Republicans, no Democrats. There's A team and B team. They're all a part of the same fraternity. So please, you guys, wake up to that shit. I'm going to play a little bit more of this.
And of course, that's part of the October, the election held hostage. The Playboy article brings that out very clearly, is that having put, he doesn't get into there, having put Carter in office to placate the people after Nixon, after Vietnam, after the civil rights struggle, that Zen gets into that. But they're taking it up at the end of the Carter era, where two things had happened. One is the Federal Reserve Board cooked the economy. And so we had runaway inflation, which would scare people. You could feel it, you could taste it, and the newspapers talked about it every day and blamed it on Carter. And when he doesn't control this stuff, the Federal Reserve Board does. And then the other thing was the national security establishment went after him with a passion. The CIA operatives cooperating with Bush-Reagan during the presidential campaign of 1980, the Pentagon cooperating, McFarlane, their Marine officer working in the State Department advising, but having committed himself to the Bush side. All of these tendrils go back to the security establishment saying, okay, we've given them Carter for 4 years, now let's get back to work. And they got Reagan in there. To summarize, they got Reagan in there, and he eventually self-destructed, or the system self-destructed under his watch. They thought they were going to have to give us Dukakis to placate the people, and then they found that the people simply don't care enough. The people simply aren't vigilant enough of their own interests to care enough about this monumental corruption from George Bush and the people around him, and they were able to continue with the A-team in office, with George Bush, to extend and continue the policies of Ronald Reagan, to exploit the nation, and to keep in lockstep with the drug runners, not to mention the military machinery.
I think that's an excellent analysis of how the establishment would view the two different candidates and why they would then decide that they could pull behind Bush and go with what you call the A-team again. It still doesn't completely explain why the B-team, that is Dukakis and the Democrats, didn't fight harder for the presidency, didn't go after Bush more aggressively on this Noriega drugs, Contra drugs, the Iran arms deals, the whole relationships of Bush and Reagan to the Ayatollahs. Why didn't Dukakis and the Democrats use these issues to probably win the election if they could have publicized them? It was the negative campaign of Bush against Dukakis that many people think helped win it for Bush. Couldn't Dukakis have done an honest negative campaign against Bush, telling the actual truth about Bush? And why didn't he? I still have trouble.
Of course. That the Reagan administration is the most corrupt in the history of the country. They've had, almost 200 people either indicted or in jail for corruption in this administration.
And the Democrats didn't go after this corruption
Didn't mention
issue.
it.
Why?
Well, this again gets back to the decision they made. I mean, we can only cite what they did, and then it speaks for itself. Dan Inouye, running this committee, a Democrat, made it a joint thing, and then the Democrats shut up and let the Republicans use it as a forum to advance the national security state, the CIA's activities, the Contra program, instead of exposing the corruption. That's where the decision was made. Dukakis is just another member of the team. Whatever economic miracle supposedly occurred in Massachusetts under his governorship was done in great part with defense expenditures. He is bought into the system. He's a member of the team. With the establishment,
wings, same bird.
as we know, as we've observed. I remember talking to Les Kurtz about this when he was developing the draft of his book, the Nuclear Cage, and we were talking about the military industrial, the Iron Triangle, the military industrial complex, the defense corporations, the Pentagon, and the Congress. And then we took it a step further. Of course, it includes the media, as everyone well knows. The point of alternative views is that the media is owned, literally, by the same people who own the defense corporations. But then we took it a step further. It's not even a quadrangle. It's a pentad or a pentagon, because you also have the universities, the educational system, in which the defense corporations and the Pentagon are careful to invest heavily. 70% of some of these big universities' budgets come from defense, money. So the professors are paid for, the salaries are paid for by the defense complex, and so they're bought into the system. So
I didn't catch that the first time I saw this, so my brain didn't click on it.
Control, and that power structure determined not to let the system be destroyed or be weakened, even at the price of their own. Let me put it this way: Jimmy Carter, for example, he demonstrated this what I would call misdirected loyalty. After the 1980 thing, he did not go public and protest the Iran-Contra deal. Mm-hmm. He did not protest it in October when he had these reports coming in, because he didn't want to destroy the system of which he was part. To go back to another era, in 1960, Richard Nixon lost to John Kennedy in a very close election, which turned in part on Mayor Daley in Chicago, counting every grave in Chicago twice. Now, this scandal was known at the time. Nixon didn't mention it until, God knows, 20 years later. He eventually said he couldn't make an issue out of without destroying the credibility of the presidential election process, and he wanted to have another shot at the presidency.
Which he got.
Which he got and became president. If he had destroyed or attacked the system, if he had exposed that scandal, it would have destroyed, perhaps, it wouldn't take all that much to lead the American people to have a big mental breakthrough and demand a change in the system, perhaps in the direction of a parliamentary system where we could, at the time of an Iran-Contra scandal, there would be forced a vote of confidence, and Reagan certainly would have been out. In December of 86, he would have been out.
Well, this is my studies on the power structure in the mass media. This is the main thing they try to keep from the American public, how the economic and political system really works. Mm-hmm. Because the Americans wouldn't like that at all if they really knew.
Saw how scared the establishment dodged a bullet, how scared they got in the Jackson run at the presidency this last time, because Jackson is the first national prominent figure since I can remember who has achieved prominence and represents the interests of the people pretty directly. And the manipulations they had to go through to keep him from getting a position of in fact, power. Just to cite one example of how far they will go, this loose association of X's from the national security, we were flying to Iowa to do a hearing to try to force the candidates to tell us their policies. At that point, there were a lot of candidates. And on the plane, the day we went up there, the New York Times had a big piece on where the polls put all the candidates at that time in Iowa. And it had Simon, I think, was leading in a big front page article, and then a long discussion, Simon and Dukakis and the others and whatnot. And then you went to page 3 for the bigger article, the details, and it turns out Jesse Jackson was running a very close second. It was sort of like 33 to 31, but his name was not mentioned on the front page of the New York Times.
Well, the Times...
And inside they showed the polls, but on the front page they didn't want him to have the name recognition.
Well, the Times and all the mainstream media pretty much did a blackout on the, excuse the metaphor, on the Jackson campaign until the Super Tuesday primaries where he won, and then he became ahead, actually, after the Michigan primaries. He was the front runner, and then they had to give some attention to Jackson, and they tried to make it negative. And then Dukakis regained the momentum in the Pennsylvania, New York primaries. So that was probably the only hope, looking back.
The party machinery shifted gears at that time, scared, because Jackson was leading, and there was a chance that the people would really get excited about this thing. And that 50% control asserted itself. The party machinery asserted itself. And Jackson was pushed down, and Dukakis was run in instead. They did it by calling Jackson a radical. They said it's not racial. We have no problem with his skin color, although there would be some people in the South who wouldn't vote for him, but he's a radical, meaning he doesn't support the establishment. And they got that word out to the party, to the party hacks throughout the nation. And the result is that Jackson's, I've been wishing and hoping, like what you said, that Jackson would split off and give us a third party. And with the people that I believe would follow him, we might be able to force onto the two-party system a viable third party.
And that makes me feel like he's controlled opposition. But I really like everything. This guy was revealing a lot of stuff, and I learned a whole lot of stuff there. So I'm sorry that maybe I put some people to sleep with this, but this was some valuable stuff right here. Remember, we want you to be an activist, and don't take our word for it. Look that shit up. Pulley.